You are sitting in the garage. The engine is disassembled across the bench. 4 hours pass and you do not notice. The next morning you sit at the desk. The tax form is 1 page. 5 minutes pass and you have written nothing. Tax form takes 20 minutes of staring before the first line gets filled. The email that should take 5 minutes takes 40. The meeting drifts in and out like a radio with reception that fades and returns without pattern. You have told yourself for decades this is a discipline problem. It is a chemistry problem. The brain maintains focus through neurons that must keep firing continuously for the duration of the task, and those neurons require a specific concentration of one molecule to sustain their firing. When the task provides that molecule through the reward pathway, focus is effortless. When it does not, the neurons cannot sustain. The signal decays and the attention drifts regardless of how hard you try. The focus was never voluntary, it was chemical. What does focus look like at the level of the neuron? Sustained firing. Neurons in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the region that maintains attention and working memory, fire at a baseline rate of approximately 5 to 10 action potentials per second during rest. During sustained attention, the firing rate increases to 20 to 40 per second and holds that elevated rate for minutes to hours. The sustained firing is the focus, the information you are holding in working memory, the numbers on the tax form, the thread of the documentary, the step-by-step logic of the engine repair, is encoded in the pattern of neurons that are maintaining their elevated firing rate. When the firing rate decays back to baseline, the pattern collapses, the working memory drops its contents, and you lose the thread. The moment you zone out during a meeting is the moment the firing rate dropped below the threshold that sustains the pattern. The information the network was holding, the point the speaker was building toward, the number you are about to write down, disappears because the neurons that were encoding it stopped sustaining. The loss feels like a lapse in attention. It is a lapse in neuronal firing rate. The distinction matters because one is a character failure and the other is a metabolic event. Your colleague in the same meeting whose attention never wavered is not trying harder. Their prefrontal neurons are sustaining their firing rate because the dopamine concentration at their D1 receptors is maintaining the signaling cascade at the level the inverted U demands. Their focus is chemical, just like yours. The difference is the concentration, not the effort. Sustained firing at 20 to 40 per second for minutes to hours is metabolically expensive. Each action potential requires the sodium-potassium pump to restore the ion gradient across the membrane, the same pump the salt discussion described consuming 30% of the brain's resting energy. Sustained attention at elevated firing rates increases the metabolic demand on prefrontal neurons above the resting baseline, and the prefrontal cortex is already among the most metabolically demanding regions in the brain. But metabolic support alone is not sufficient. The neurons require a specific neuromodulatory signal to maintain their elevated firing rate across the duration of a task. Dopamine, acting at D1 receptors on the prefrontal pyramidal neurons, sustained prefrontal firing and its dependence on dopamine modulation is established computational neuroscience. Prefrontal neurons require continuous dopaminergic input at D1 receptors to maintain the elevated firing rates that encode working memory and sustained attention. Goldman-Rakic established this in Neuron. The neurons must sustain their firing. The firing requires a specific concentration of dopamine at D1 receptors, and the relationship between that concentration and the neuron's ability to sustain follows a curve that explains everything you have experienced for 6 decades. What is the curve and why does it determine everything? Inverted U. The relationship between dopamine concentration at prefrontal D1 receptors and sustained neuronal firing follows an inverted U dose-response curve. Too little dopamine on the left side of the curve. The D1 receptor stimulation is insufficient to maintain the signaling cascade inside the neuron that keeps it firing above baseline. The sustained firing decays. Working memory drops its contents. Attention drifts. You stare at the tax form, read the same line 3 times, and realize you absorbed nothing. You go back to the beginning. You read the same paragraph again. The words are familiar. The meaning slides off. You check your phone not because you chose to, but because the prefrontal neurons lost the firing pattern that was holding the task, and the brain defaulted to a stimulus that provides its own dopamine through the mesolimbic pathway. The phone is more interesting than the form. The phone supplies dopamine. The form does not. The neurons follow the dopamine. You blamed yourself for the phone. The neurons were following the chemistry. Optimal dopamine at the peak of the curve. D1 stimulation maintains the signaling cascade at the level that sustains firing for the duration of the task. The neuron holds its elevated rate. Working memory is stable. Attention sustains. You follow the documentary for 2 hours without effort. You recall specific details days later. You make connections between the documentary and things you already know. The neurons are operating at their optimal concentration, and the cognitive performance at the peak is not merely adequate, it is often superior. The focus at the peak of the inverted U frequently produces work that surprises both you and the people who know you as someone who cannot sustain attention. The quality was always available. The chemistry to access it was intermittent. Too much dopamine on the right side of the curve, D1 overstimulation. The neurons fire to everything. To neurons fire to everything. Every input, every distraction, every stray thought produces the same elevated firing rate as the relevant task. The signal-to-noise ratio collapses. You cannot filter. Too many inputs competing for the same neural resources. Every conversation in the room registers at the same salience as the speaker you are trying to follow. Every visual movement in the peripheral field pulls the same attentional weight as the document you are trying to read. The prefrontal cortex, overstimulated at D1, loses its ability to suppress the irrelevant inputs that healthy filtering requires. The jittery, scattered, overwhelmed state the coffee discussion described as cortisol caffeine compounding is the right side of the same curve, pushed past the peak by 2 alertness drivers stacking simultaneously. Inverted U, dose response at prefrontal D1 receptors determines sustained firing capacity. Prefrontal cognitive function follows an inverted U relationship with catecholamine stimulation, with both insufficient and excessive levels producing impairment through different mechanisms. Arnsten described this curve in psychopharmacology. Your position on the curve determines whether you can focus. The position is set by dopamine concentration at the prefrontal D1 receptor. What determines your position on the curve? Concentration depends on 2 variables: how much dopamine is released and how fast it is cleared from the synapse. The release is one half of the equation. The clearance is the half that differs most dramatically between the brain that focuses easily and the brain that has struggled for decades. I sat with the inverted U for a long time the week the curve replaced the word discipline in my understanding of my own focus, inconsistency. The engine at 4 hours was the peak. The tax form at 5 minutes was the left side. Same brain, same receptors, same curve. Different dopamine concentration. The variable was never effort. The variable was where the chemistry placed me on the curve. What clears the dopamine, and why does it run too fast in some brains? Dopamine transporter. A protein embedded in the presynaptic membrane that pulls released dopamine back out of the synaptic cleft after it has acted on the receptor. A vacuum cleaner in the synapse. The dopamine is released, crosses the cleft, binds the D1 receptor, produces its effect, and the transporter pulls it back for recycling. The clearance is continuous. The transporter runs every second the synapse is active. In the brain that focuses easily, the transporter clears dopamine at a rate that maintains the prefrontal concentration near the peak of the inverted U during attentive tasks. The dopamine is released, acts on the receptor, and is cleared at a pace that sustains the concentration in the optimal zone. Release and clearance in balance. The peak is maintained. The firing sustains. In the brain with attention difficulty, the transporter density is higher. Imaging studies consistently show elevated dopamine transporter density in the prefrontal region, with the degree varying between individuals. Spencer and colleagues measured this elevation through positron emission tomography and molecular psychiatry. More transporters means faster clearance. Each transporter protein binds a dopamine molecule in the synaptic cleft, undergoes a conformational change that rotates the binding site from the extracellular face to the intracellular face of the membrane, and releases the dopamine inside the presynaptic terminal for recycling. The cycle takes milliseconds. Hundreds of transporters operating simultaneously in each synapse clear the released dopamine within a narrow time window. Methylphenidate works by binding to the same site on the transporter that dopamine binds, physically preventing the conformational change. The transporter cannot rotate. The dopamine stays in the cleft longer. the concentration at the D1 receptor rises. The operating point on the inverted U shifts toward the peak. Without the medication, the dopamine is pulled out of the synapse before the sustained firing can maintain itself, only when the transporters outnumber the drug molecules occupying them. The prefrontal concentration sits on the left side of the inverted U, below optimal. The neurons cannot sustain. The signal decays. The attention drifts. The experience, repeated thousands of times across 6 decades of classrooms, meetings, paperwork, and conversations, accumulates into an identity: undisciplined, unfocused, lazy, bright but unreliable. Each repetition of the failed focus experience reinforced the narrative. Each narrative reinforcement was built on a transporter density variable the narrative never accounted for. A thermostat trying to heat a room where too many air conditioning units were installed. The fuel is there. The system produces heat normally, but the cooling units pull the heat out faster than the heater can sustain the target temperature. The room stays cold. The heater is not broken. The clearance is too aggressive. The concentration never reaches the thermostat's target. The focus never reaches the curve's peak. You have been told for 60 years that the problem is the heater. Try harder. Burn more fuel. Apply more effort. The heater was never the problem. The air conditioning was running too aggressively. The effort was never the missing variable. The clearance rate was. Now the transporter clears the dopamine too fast. The baseline concentration sits on the left side of the curve. The neurons cannot sustain, but you can focus on some things. The engine, the documentary, the hobby, for hours without any effort at all. The paradox resolves through a second dopamine source the baseline pathway cannot provide. Why does the engine hold your attention when the tax form cannot? 2 dopamine pathways feed the prefrontal cortex. The mesocortical pathway provides tonic, baseline dopamine release. This is the standing supply. In the brain with high transporter density, this baseline supply is cleared too fast, and the resting position on the inverted U sits on the left side. Mesolimbic pathway provides phasic, burst dopamine release, triggered by reward, novelty, interest, urgency. When the task is genuinely interesting, the engine, the documentary, the puzzle that captivates, the mesolimbic pathway floods the system with additional dopamine. The surge compensates for the high transporter clearance. The prefrontal concentration reaches the peak of the inverted U despite the aggressive clearance. Sustained firing engages, focus locks in. You lose track of time because the chemistry reached the peak the baseline supply could never sustain. This also explains the deadline paradox. The looming deadline creates urgency, and urgency triggers mesolimbic dopamine release. The report you could not start for 3 weeks gets written in 4 hours the night before it is due, not because the pressure made you try harder, but because the urgency provided the phasic dopamine boost that shifted you from the left side of the curve to the peak. The quality of the deadline work often surprises you. The quality was always available. The chemistry to access it was not. The performance under deadline pressure is the clearest proof that the cognitive hardware works. The intelligence, the creativity, the ability to synthesize complex information into coherent output, all demonstrated under deadline conditions when the mesolimbic surge shifted the operating point to the peak. The decades of performance inconsistency were never evidence of insufficient ability. They were evidence of insufficient baseline dopamine to access the ability that was always present in the hardware. When the task carries no intrinsic interest, the tax form, the email, the meeting, the mesolimbic pathway provides minimal phasic release. The baseline mesocortical supply, already cleared too fast by elevated transporter density, cannot sustain the prefrontal concentration at the peak. The neurons cannot sustain. The signal decays. You drift. The focus followed the concentration. The concentration followed the chemistry. If you can focus on the engine and cannot focus on the taxes, you are experiencing the same prefrontal cortex, the same D1 receptors, the same inverted U, at 2 different dopamine concentrations set by whether the mesolimbic reward pathway supplements the baseline supply. The question parents, teachers, spouses, and you yourself have asked for decades: if you can do it there, why can you not do it here? Has a physics answer. The dopamine concentration at the D1 receptor differs between the 2 tasks. The receptor is the same. The curve is the same. The concentration changes. The focus follows the concentration. The spouse who watched you rebuild the engine for 4 hours and then asked why you could not spend 20 minutes on the taxes was asking a question that had a physics answer. The same prefrontal cortex produced both outcomes. The difference was the dopamine supply available to sustain the firing during each task. The engine provided its own supply through the mesolimbic pathway. The taxes did not. The effort was identical. The chemistry was not. The curve explains the inconsistency. The transporter explains the baseline deficit. The two sources explain why interest compensates. Every piece of your 6-decade puzzle fits the physics. One question remains, the one you ask when you first hear about medication. If a stimulant speeds things up, why would it help someone who seems to need things slowed down? Why does a stimulant calm the brain? Paradox resolves through the inverted U. The brain with elevated transporter density operates on the left side of the curve, below optimal dopamine. On the left side, neurons fire randomly because they cannot sustain focused firing. Every input triggers a brief response. Nothing sustains. The experience is scattered, noisy, unfocused. The brain is understimulated. The noise comes from the absence of sustained firing, not from the presence of too much. Methylphenidate blocks the dopamine transporter. The vacuum cleaner slows down. Dopamine stays in the synapse longer. The concentration rises. The operating point on the inverted U shifts from the left side toward the peak. At the peak, neurons sustain focused firing. Random noise decreases. The signal-to-noise ratio improves. The brain gets quieter. The scattered experience resolves into sustained, directed attention. The first time this happens, the experience is often described the same way. The noise stopped. The internal chatter, the competing thoughts, the constant pull toward distraction, all of it quiets because the neurons are now sustaining their firing on the relevant task instead of firing randomly at every passing input. The quiet is what sustained firing feels like from the inside. The noise was what the left side of the curve felt like. The stimulant did not add stimulation. It shifted the operating point from a noisy, unfocused region of the curve to the focused, sustained firing region. The brain was understimulated at baseline, and the medication brought it to optimal. Eyeglasses for a prefrontal cortex that could not sustain its own firing rate. The glasses do not fix the eyes. They compensate for the optics while you wear them. The medication does not fix the transporter density. It compensates for the clearance rate while the drug is active. Remove the glasses, the vision returns to baseline. Remove the medication, the clearance returns to baseline. The compensation is real. The underlying physics remains. And then, the same drug in a brain that already sits near the peak. The additional dopamine pushes the operating point past the peak to the right side of the curve. The neurons fire to everything, the jittery, anxious, overfocused state. The inverted U predicts both outcomes from the same molecule depending on where the brain starts on the curve. The medication is the same. The starting position differs. The curve determines the result. Medication shifts the operating point on the curve. Whether medication is appropriate for your specific situation is a clinical determination your physician makes through evaluation. The physics teaches what the medication does to the curve. The physician determines whether the curve explains the pattern in your case and whether shifting the operating point is appropriate. The physics teaches the mechanism. The physician determines the diagnosis through structured evaluation, clinical history, and assessment tools that measure the pattern across multiple domains of functioning, work, relationships, daily organization, task completion, emotional regulation. The evaluation assesses where you sit on the spectrum the inverted U describes, and whether the position on the curve accounts for the pattern the physics predicts. Physics describes a spectrum every brain operates on. The inverted U is universal. Every person experiences the difference between interesting task focus and boring task struggle. The physics in this section describes the extreme end, where the difference is so large it has shaped career choices, relationships, self-concept, and daily functioning for decades. Before 1980, the diagnosis required hyperactivity, fidgeting, the inability to sit still, the quiet child who daydreamed through every lecture but aced the tests when the material was interesting, the student who is smart but does not apply himself on every report card for 12 years, the adult who could not start tasks without a deadline but produced brilliant work in the final hours when urgency provided the mesolimbic surge the baseline could not. The girl who was never disruptive, never hyperactive, never identified, because her presentation was inattention without the visible motor overflow the diagnostic criteria of the era required. None of these were recognized. The diagnostic criteria expanded in 1994 to include the predominantly inattentive type. By then you were 30 to 50 years old. The physics had been operating for your entire life. The career you built around the pattern, choosing work that provided enough novelty and urgency to keep the mesolimbic pathway supplementing the baseline, was an adaptation to a curve you could not see, but whose effects shaped every decision about what work you could sustain and what work you could not. The physics was available. The recognition was not. Recognition. Smart, but doesn't apply himself. Lazy, undisciplined. Could do so much more if he just tried. Decades of labels applied to a dose-response curve and a reuptake transporter. The careers chosen around the pattern rather than through it. The jobs selected because they provided enough novelty and urgency to keep the mesolimbic pathway, supplementing the baseline. The relationship strained by a partner who watched you focus for hours on something that interested you and could not understand why you could not apply the same effort to what mattered to them. The project started with enthusiasm that faded as the novelty wore off and the mesolimbic supplements declined, leaving the baseline supply insufficient to finish what the dopamine surge started. The willpower was never missing. The molecule was cleared too fast for the neurons to sustain. The effort was always present. The concentration was not. If you recognize the extreme end of this spectrum in your own experience, you may benefit from a conversation with a physician who can assess whether the operating point on the curve explains the pattern. The physics describes the mechanism. The physician determines the diagnosis. My understanding of the decades-long pattern shifted the evening the inverted U reached my own biography. Smart but doesn't apply himself. The report cards, the missed deadlines, the projects that started brilliantly and died at 80% completion, the engine in the garage at 4 hours, the taxes on the desk at 0, 60 years of self-blame resolved into a dose-response curve. The effort was real. The concentration was what it was. The curve never asked how hard you tried. The curve asked where the chemistry placed you on it. And then, what shifts the curve without medication? Exercise, the broadest dopamine-boosting input available without a prescription. Aerobic exercise increases both dopamine and norepinephrine in the prefrontal cortex through increased activity of tyrosine hydroxylase, the enzyme that catalyzes the rate-limiting step in dopamine synthesis. The increase begins within 10 minutes of sustained aerobic activity, rises progressively during the session, and persists for 60 to 90 minutes after the session ends. The elevation is measurable across the prefrontal cortex and the striatum, the two regions most relevant to sustained attention and reward processing. The magnitude of the increase is proportional to the exercise intensity and duration, with 30 minutes of moderate activity producing a reliable shift in prefrontal dopamine availability. The window is specific and predictable. If you have struggled with focus for decades, you may find that the most difficult tasks become manageable when placed inside this post-exercise window. Not because the exercise changed the brain permanently, but because the exercise temporarily shifted the operating point on the curve the transporter density normally holds on the left side. If you exercise in the morning and then tackle the difficult task, you are doing the task form at a different position on the inverted U than if you sit down cold. The exercise shifted your position on the curve toward the peak for the duration of the post-exercise window. The practical application is specific. Exercise first, then tackle the most demanding cognitive task within the 60 to 90-minute window, while the prefrontal dopamine and norepinephrine levels are elevated. The task form that is impossible at 8 in the morning without exercise may be manageable at 9:30 after a 30-minute walk, because the walk shifted your operating point on the curve by the amount the exercise-induced dopamine release provided. Now, novelty and challenge calibration. The mesolimbic pathway responds to novelty. Breaking a boring task into smaller pieces with micro-rewards, checking items off, timing sprints, alternating with interesting tasks, provides phasic dopamine pulses that supplement the baseline. You're providing the mesolimbic dopamine supplements the prefrontal cortex needs to sustain firing. The timer on the phone set for 25 minutes of focused work, followed by a 5-minute break, is a dopamine management strategy that provides the micro-reward, the break approaching, the interval completing, that keeps the mesolimbic pathway contributing phasic bursts to the prefrontal concentration during a task that provides no intrinsic reward. Well, caffeine, adenosine blockade disinhibits dopamine neurons through receptor decoupling. For you on the left side of the inverted U, caffeine may shift the operating point toward optimal. For you already near the peak, caffeine may push you to the right side, the jittery, scattered, over-caffeinated state. The inverted U predicts both outcomes from the same molecule depending on where you start on the curve. The predictive power of the curve is what makes it the central concept. One curve explains hyperfocus on interesting tasks, distractibility on boring tasks, the calming effect of stimulant medication in one brain, the jittery effect of the same medication in another brain, and the variable response to caffeine across different individuals. One curve. Every outcome. You sat in the garage for 4 hours. You sat at the desk for 5 minutes. For 6 decades, the explanation was effort. The physics says the explanation was concentration, a specific molecule at a specific receptor, maintaining a specific firing rate in the neurons that hold attention. When the task provided the molecule through the reward pathway, the firing sustained and the focus was effortless. When it did not, the transporter cleared the molecule faster than the baseline supply could replace it. The firing decayed, and the attention drifted, not because you stopped trying, but because the neurons lost the chemical that was holding the pattern in place. The willpower was always there. The dopamine concentration was not. The curve was never about trying harder. The curve was about where the chemistry placed you on it.